Hi everyone, I want to start by saying thank you for having me here today. My name's Alex and I'm here to talk about my Masters in Digital Heritage research that I did while at the University of York. And the theme that I was looking at was playing dress up in the past, how we could use digital dress up games as a way to display historical textile collections online. So starting with kind of the context for this research, I was looking at how textiles are currently displayed. So there was a study in 2007 by Sasky that found that with textile collections and costuming, a lot of the items are actually missing images. The photographs where they do occur tend to be from only one angle, dress forms are infrequently used, and the photographs are often not enlargeable, so you can't like zoom in on details and stuff. And although kind of a lot of years have passed since 2007, and a lot of changes have happened, better photography and digitization of a lot of collections, it seems like with costumes and garments that this has kind of not kept up at the same pace. That tends to be the last collection people are digitizing almost, and maybe that's to do with the challenges of it being something quite fragile and also kind of floaty and not that nice to sort of lay out and photograph. Another big problem is that the data is not linked to other objects. So you're seeing a garment, for example, a shirt in isolation, and not understanding how that would be worn as part of a wider outfit, which is obviously not how we wear clothes. We don't just wear one thing at a time. We wear it as part of a collective ensemble. So I was really interested in ways we could kind of display textile collections better online and introduce some of the fun elements that you get in museums like the dress-up station. Is there a way that we could do that and bring that play into the online space? So my dissertation supervisor, Dr. Colleen Morgan, she suggested that I take a look at games and the different costumes in them. And it kind of got me thinking about these digital dress-up games that I used to really love playing when I was younger. So in case any of you didn't play these and had the same childhood as I did, these are basically games that are around in the early 2000s. They're the digital descendant of the paper doll, which has been a popular children's game for over 200 years. And what they kind of do is you get a doll and you just dress it up in lots of different options. You might not have played one of these games specifically, which are kind of browser-based and free to play, but if you've ever played any kind of role-playing game, you've probably gone through some sort of avatar creator and customization at the start of the game, and that can almost become a game in itself. That's when I'm playing The Sims, that's the only bit I care about. When you get to actually like going to work and meeting the needs of your Sims, I can't really be bothered with that stuff. I just like dressing it up. So I was interested in kind of ways these could be used, and I had three main research questions, which was, could these games be a suitable format in which you could showcase historical textile collections? And then what do the current games out there actually look like that are calling themselves historical dress-ups? And also, what do people expect from a historically themed dress-up? What would they like to see? So to answer these, I used a mixture of methods. The first was I looked at some of the existing games out there. So I looked at 213 unique games across 3 major platforms, which are Azalea's Dress Up Dolls, Dolls Divine, and DressUpGames.com. I only looked at those games that were tagged under the historical category, but it's worth noting that there would be kind of many more historical elements in games all over the platform. There's literally tens of thousands of games on these platforms. I couldn't go through every one and see if there was a historical element. But I know that especially in like the fantasy categories, you're going to get a lot of kind of medieval-esque costuming appearing there as well. I then did a user design survey. So I asked 208 respondents, most of which had come from the r/historical costuming subreddit, kind of interested in what they'd like to see in the game and treating them as potential players. And I also did some case studies while I was kind of sending the surveys out. So I wanted to see what museums were currently doing, whether anyone was using this type of game. And I only found 4 examples online. So if you've got any other examples you've seen kind of in museums, please let me know. I'd love to hear about them. These are the 3 that I found that were available to play online, and they kind of feature the interface with your doll that you're able to dress up in a series of different clothing. However, what made these games quite different is they went very heavy on the educational aspect, but without actually giving any information. They just said there's kind of a correct order in which to dress your character and a correct selection and combination of garments. So without actually providing you the context, you didn't really know how to achieve that correct combination. You were just sort of pressing buttons or using your pre-existing knowledge, and it becomes a game that's not actually that fun to play and kind of takes away from this free play aspect and infinite possibilities that is what makes the dress-up games so fun. The only example I could find of a museum actually using this kind of free play aspect was AR Imperial Attire that was in the Hall of Mental Cultivation in the Palace Museum in Beijing. And this consisted of these huge 2-meter tall touchscreens with this kind of big paper doll that you could dress and swipe through and select different outfits for the doll to wear. But unfortunately, this was only I could only find record of this, and you couldn't actually play the game online. It wasn't available, even though obviously all the graphics have been created, and this seems like something that could be easily translated to reach online audiences too. So when I got the results back from the survey, both of the existing games and what people would like to see, there were a few key themes that kind of popped up. So people were really interested in having more diverse representation in the dolls. So people wanted to be able to customize their avatar and make it look like themselves. The skin tone customization, so that was the most popular customization feature that people were requesting. And just about half of the existing games had this option. Where the games didn't, it was normally that they were kind of representing a specific character. So you had a lot of Disney princesses that were being dressed in different eras. So stuff like Art Deco Elsa was appearing, and you've seen the Victorian Barbie on the earlier screen too. The second most popular customization option was gender. So people were wanting to be able to switch up the gender of their character, have a range of appearances available, but also a range of wardrobes. So people weren't happy with just having kind of the traditionally coded women's wardrobe. They wanted access to menswear as well and able to switch back and forth in order to have the most playable options. Class was another interesting theme. So most of the dolls already in existence are kind of royalty or princess themes. But people also wanted the ability to access kind of working class dress of the period as well. And when people were asked, they kind of specified in the open text box that this was something they really wanted, but then there was also a group of people that kind of said the reverse. They specifically wanted to play as very rich people who had a very large wardrobe so that they could go through kind of all the options. I also asked some questions about kind of the historical content and source material that people wanted to see, and people were happy to see a range of sources, not just fully intact garments, and they were willing to accept some degree of inaccuracy as well. So even though I was asking a group of historical costumers, they didn't want everything to be completely accurate if it impaired the function of the game and the enjoyability. So you can see here, character creator was like the biggest tag. So this was the thing people were most looking for. All the games had kind of a tag underneath them. And so I analysed those. Another really popular feature tag is afro hair that appears as well. That's the second most popular kind of attribute or feature of the doll. And then when it came to time periods, you can see the 19th century is kind of the biggest period tag. So this was really interesting, actually, because in the survey data of potential players, the 19th century and the Victorian era came out as the most popular. This was also the largest stated era in the existing games, so I kind of didn't go off what the games were looking like. I had to go just off what the description was saying or the title, because there's some very dubious Victorian dress-ups out there that I don't think they had silver sequins in the same way as like the Victorian Barbie is dressed up in the Victorian period, but maybe I can be proven wrong. And so yeah, it was really interesting that kind of this was appearing really highly in both of the surveys. And it was also interesting to find data done by Mearns in 2020, looking at dress-up sites in museums in the National Trust properties. And they found that Victorian and Edwardian dress-ups were also most popular there. So this informed the content of the game I was going to design. I decided to stick with Victorian because it was so popular. I think maybe as like a period of consumerism, it's one we've got a lot of historical records for in terms of fashion, and it's also like significantly different from how we dress today, that it's quite interesting to play as. However, it's a very broad term to say Victorian, and multiple people highlighted this to me in the open text box. They wanted it more defined and broken down further because the silhouettes of the 1840s are very, very different to what you're seeing with kind of the bustle at the end of the century. So this informed the content of the game, and then the aesthetics was informed by the survey as well. People selected the highly detailed illustration as the most preferred option, which was unfortunate for me because I was then to go on to create the game and I had to reproduce these illustrations. So not accounting for my time in making the game, I wanted to try and keep this as cheap as possible, recognizing that a lot of smaller museums would maybe like to have access to doing something like this. It's something that could be achievable for them, but they wouldn't have a large budget to spend on it. So I used images from the Manchester Art Gallery and the Victoria and Albert Museum because these were high quality images available for me to use. And then I just used a little Wacom-1 graphics tablet and I made up the doll in Autodesk Sketchbook. So you can see the kind of setup here, and how the game works is you've got this layers panel. Each garment goes in its own layer. And then when you import the game into maker.io, which is a free website that allows you just to upload a PSD file, it creates the game from this and it ends up looking something a little bit like this. So this is the interface you get. And maker.io is linked to Doll Divine. So some of the games from maker.io, if they're really good, they end up getting migrated over to like the official site. And the Maker site is open to anyone, so there's a whole range of dress-ups that people are creating just because they love creating them. So in total, there was 36 different garments included in the game. I tried to make use of women's wear. I wanted to add in some menswear. However, due to kind of the function of the game, you've got the same doll all the time, so you have to make sure you're keeping consistent silhouettes, which does influence things like it's very hard to put trousers on if you've got a bustle and skirt on underneath. And you've got this dice at the top that allows you to randomize, so you can create like a completely random combination. And then if you tick the little tick box, you get a final image that you can kind of save to your computer or print out as well. So there were a few factors in kind of making this game and using museum collections that I think apply to more than just dress-up games. So the first was thinking about making concessions to the genre. So in order to make the game the most fun, it needed to have lots of different parts. So I decided to break outfits into separate pieces. I also decided to raise the hemlines as well so that you could see the shoes, and this gave like another thing you could customize. And then I had, when I was picking which objects to include, I had to consider kind of what fabrics I'd be able to draw. So starting off with satin and lace was probably a bad idea on my part. But this is, where I chose to start. It only got easier from there, so that was nice. And as I said, the silhouettes had to be consistent as well. I also had to make use of kind of additional source material where there were gaps in the collections. So there's a lack of working class women's wear in museum collections. It tends to be kind of rich, ornate garments that are in there, which means I had to also include kind of illustrations. I also didn't have information from the collections about stuff like hairstyles, what makeup would have been like, the pose that would have been selected, and different accessories. And the final thing I had to think about was managing what was actually available. So I was dealing with images sometimes that were flat, had inconsistent posing, and unknown dates as well. So all of these were notably worse when I was looking at non-Western textiles, so things outside of the British context. I decided that I wanted to include both British garments and also garments made in India in order to kind of the big idea is to probe the question of imperialism and the connections in fashion between Britain and India at the time. So I narrowed it down to the 1870s and 1880s. But with some of these garments, for example, this skirt, the listing on the website is just 19th century, which makes it quite difficult. So in the end, though, I was very happy with my game, and it will be playable later. And I'd be really happy to talk to you about kind of the next steps of what I'm thinking of doing with it and any feedback you've got. And I'd love to see what you create, whether it's you're trying to make a cohesive garment or whether you just go completely random and create something that you think expresses your own identity, and yeah, just have fun with it. So thank you very much.